Looking back at the past, it all makes sense now. Fate had no hand in our meeting. I was taught that fate doesn't exist, but the moment we as humans accept accidents as inevitable, then it becomes fate. If my teacher taught me right, then fate never existed for us. My name is Annette Rozenberg, and this is my story. The skies were painted in different shades of purple by the fading sun, and its rays stained the arched windows of the hallways as I walked through, casting long shadows in my path. I let myself into his study, an envelope in my hand. I called out to him and asked if he wouldn't like to read the letter I had with me. I slapped it down on the table. It was a confidential letter addressed to me. But my husband, Heiner, casually shrugged, said he was busy and we'd talk later. He returned to his work, scribbling away on a parchment paper without regarding me any further. That didn't faze me. I had a couple of things on my mind to say to him. I dropped the bombshell. I'd gone through the trouble of digging up his past. That seemed to catch his attention. And he stopped writing to look up at me. I'd always wondered why he treated me the way he did, why he'd changed all of a sudden. Even if he'd fallen out of love, he was taking it way too far. He sighed my name aloud, eager to put an end to the conversation. But I told him that I'd figured it all out. I asked him if he'd always had an agenda for me right from the beginning. And my bluntness stunned him into admitting the truth. He had. I let out a sad laugh, empty of amusement and bitter with hurt. I reasoned aloud that it must have felt hard to love the daughter of his enemy. Looking back in time, the meeting I'd attributed to fate had been under his control the whole time. I'd been so in love on our wedding day, so happy to be Heiner's bride. But he'd played me from the very beginning. You see, the kingdom of Pedania was ruled by a tyrant monarchy. My father, Marquess Dietrich Rosenberg, was the king's nephew, and we were a part of the royal family. My father had been the general of the Pedania army, and Heiner was his favorite commander. I'd been at the ceremony of his knighting, and I saw the pride in my father's eyes when he looked at Commander Heiner Waldemar. One day in late spring, when the roses were at their most spectacular full bloom, there was a meeting in the Rosenberg mansion. I bumped into Heiner. At least I thought I had. What followed was 2 years of courtship that ended in marriage. But my happily ever after didn't last at all. In fact, it came to an end sooner than I could have imagined. The people rebelled against the royal family, and many nobles were killed, including my father. My mother, devastated by the news, took her own life. And at the center of the rebellion, as the flag bearer and commander-in-chief, was Heiner Waldemar. But I was still blinded by my foolishness. I still trusted him, even though he was responsible for the death of my family and everyone else that mattered to me. Then without warning, he changed. No, he just showed his true colors. He treated me with dispassion, like the enemy. Even yet, I was still disillusioned and assumed that our meeting on that rose field was the work of fate. Even with my family gone, the people wanted more. They wanted me dead. What had I ever done to them? I'd tried to understand my husband, make excuses for him. He'd had no other choice since the times were changing. The hunger for my head increased by the day. But I remained trusting Heiner's love. The hatred and taunting intensified. In the eyes of the people, I would always be the villain. The daughter of the military officer who oppressed the civilians. I was called a superficial woman who enjoyed living off the blood of others. Such cruel accusations. I took all of it, even though I'd been so clueless about the politics that my family had played behind the scenes. I lived in limbo, merely existing, so alone. But I'd waited for Heiner in the hope that he'd stand by me. Where did I go wrong? Did I commit a crime by simply being alive? I finally found my answer. The why. It was all in the letter. I remember trying to change his mind. How foolish I was. It was pointless because he'd never changed in the first place. He just never loved me from the start. I looked at him square in the eyes and asked him to prove me wrong. With only a moment's hesitation, he finally answered no. I felt my heart twitch with hurt inside my chest. I demanded the truth from him. I deserved to hear it all from his mouth after all, didn't I? Heiner was silent for a while before his lips slowly curled up in a smirk. Then he let it all out. The truth. He'd loathed my father and the monarchy. That was the truth. Approaching me had just been part of the plan. He said all of this with a nonchalance that stunned me to silence. And then, with a heavy heart, I asked him if I was also an object of his loathing. I wonder what I'd expected to hear because nothing would have prepared me for the words that came out of his mouth next. He told me then about how 2 years ago there'd been a big fuss over reports that the monarchs were raising spies. He clenched his fist as he continued. Heiner confessed to being a spy at the training camp overlooked by my father. The spies were groomed to be killed during missions or eliminated to keep dark secrets. Only Heiner had survived because he'd made himself invaluable to the kingdom with his services. After my father strengthened his reputation as General of Pedania, he was content to keep Heiner by his side, and that was how we met. Silly me. And there I'd been, sympathizing with him for losing his comrades in battle. Heiner continued. He admitted that seeing me in my innocence, dressed nicely, and speaking of condolence like it was a priceless gift, made him realize that something was wrong. Was I included as an object of loathing? He dropped the answer. He despised me. I felt my chest constrict even more with hurt and betrayal as I let out a little gasp. My questions were answered. He'd approached me to take his revenge. Heiner Waldemar, he despised me from the very beginning, through the fake smiles and all. I finally admitted that learning the truth made things easier. Without knowing all of this, I'd loved him. But I was done. I told him that I wanted a divorce, and he plainly told me that he couldn't grant me that. I was shocked. I asked him why. What use did he have for me? My parents were dead and the monarchy was out of his way for good, and I was left with nothing. All that I had left I had because I was Waldemar's wife. He'd won. Couldn't he see that? What more could he possibly want from me? But Heiner slammed his hand on the table as he rose to his feet. He walked around the table until he was towering over me, his eyes dimmed with hatred. He called my name and grabbed my face roughly. Then he asked how I could dream of being happy elsewhere. In my defiance, I told him there was nowhere I could find happiness again. But this only pleased him. He leaned in closer and said that it made things easier. If that was the case, then I was going to remain forever unhappy by his side. What kind of sick psycho could say such a thing? Seeing him enveloped in scarlet opened my eyes to see clearly. His revenge had only begun. The line between memories and dreams blurred in my mind. When I shut my eyes, I couldn't tell which was which. Was this now a dream or a memory? We sat out in the rose fields under the clear skies. I gushed over how Heiner was so incredible at everything. I asked him how many languages he spoke, and he answered 4. I was so awed by his answer and admitted I was not as exceptional as he was. I was too scared to leave Pedania and had no real talent for studying at all. But Heiner, kind as always, quickly pointed out how I could play the piano. I blushed in modesty and confessed my doubts about my future to him. Heiner quickly reassured me, his eyes warm with kindness. He was so certain I'd become a great pianist. I blushed again. It seemed to be the only thing I could do around him. I asked if he'd heard me play before, and he brushed it off by saying I looked like a natural. How did he always know to say the right thing at the right time? I laughed to hide my blush and complimented his sense of humor. Moments later, we were out on the open sea, drifting slowly in a boat under the light of the moon. Heiner took my hands in his and asked the question that changed my life forever. He asked me to marry him. The diamond ring glinted under the light of the moon. I sang his name in a mixture of joy and surprise, admiring the ring on my finger. It was perfect. Heiner promised to make me happy forever. I flew into his arms, swept away by the fantasy of a forever with the man I loved. Suddenly, the words forever and happy rang out repeatedly. The sound was as ominous as the darkness around us, building in suspense until it climaxed into Heiner's malicious promise to keep me unhappy by his side forever. I flinched in horror, my eyes darting wide open. Suddenly, the realization hit me. As I gripped the bedsheets tightly across my chest, my hands trembling, I admitted the truth to myself. I'd only been dreaming. How much of Heiner had seeped deep into the fabrics of my soul? By morning, I picked up a newspaper and the headline came flying at me like an assault. The people wanted the remnants of the Pedania monarchy gone. They saw no use in preserving it, in preserving me. I felt my head ache with dizziness and realized I needed air. I walked quietly through the hallway, my steps echoing against the walls. I was too lost in my thoughts to notice I wasn't alone until he called out. Major Eugene Markov, Heiner's most devout subordinate. He flashed a false smile on his face as he greeted and hoped that all was well with me. But I could read beneath the surface and hear the sarcasm in his words. He'd be pleased if all wasn't well. I kept my gaze on the floor as I answered and said nothing had changed and quickly excused myself to leave. I'd hardly taken a step forward when Major Markov dropped a bombshell. Heiner had received a marriage proposal. I paused, rooted to the spot by his words. I could hear the malicious satisfaction in his voice as he spoke. He asked if I knew Annalie. Apparently, she'd been by Heiner's side during the rebellion and earned the people's support for her role in the victory. I listened to him in shock, and even though I had my back turned to him, I could hear the smile in his voice as he asked if I thought they'd be a good couple. I smiled sadly and answered in the affirmative. Then Markov turned around to face me, his voice full of irritation as he spoke. He said the media was going to spread the news and asked how long I was going to remain carefree. Was he really saying something new? Like I had no idea what was happening around me? The people wanted my demise. The newspapers wanted every trace of the monarchy wiped out, including me. I was threatened and abused in letters I received every day. Being Heiner's wife brought me nothing but pain. Markov slapped his forehead in exasperation and said I was Heiner's only flaw. He asked if I had any idea why people thought about my marriage. I quickly told him that I'd asked Heiner for a divorce. Markov looked at me in surprise and disbelief. I plainly told him that Heiner wouldn't accept my request because he wanted to watch me suffer. I'd only learned that fact a little too late. I looked up at Markov and asked him to help persuade Heiner to let me go since we both clearly wanted the same thing for once. I knew the truth. Everyone loathed me. I was the enemy. The realization made my heart burn with grief. Why had I ever assumed that Heiner was any different than them? That he loved me where they hated me and my family? I felt stupid. While in my bedroom later in the day, I heard a knock on the door but remained silent. I heard the door open and someone stepped in. Heiner, I knew at once. He called out to me and sat on the bedside. He casually said he knew I was awake and asked me to listen to what he had to say. He said he was going to decline Annalie's proposal quietly before the news broke out. Heiner told her I wasn't going to accept the proposal and asked me to forget about ever leaving. If he claimed to hate me, why did he even want to keep me from leaving? He couldn't even say the word divorce aloud. I finally spoke. I told him that people thought I was living an expensive life on his account and wondered why we were still married. I told him how they called me a flaw that had to be wiped out of his life. I wondered to myself if this was just about watching me wither away by his side, if there was something more. I asked him if he hated me that much to take such risks. Then he admitted, calling my name softly before continuing and saying that he didn't know what guarantee I had to live a better life outside the palace. I laughed bitterly and asked if he thought I had an inheritance hidden away somewhere. He knew I had nothing or anywhere to go. But he wasn't taking any chances. My father had too many connections who had the resources to help me. I quickly interjected and told him I didn't need anyone's help. All I wanted was the divorce. Simple. Heiner's eyes dimmed into slits in anger as he glared at me. He said that since I wanted the divorce so badly, it made him all the more willing to keep me for as long as he could. As I stared into those eyes that had once looked down at me with so much love, I couldn't help but wonder when exactly they became filled with such darkness. Why didn't I notice it? Why couldn't I read through his smiles and loving voice? Why had I fallen so deeply in love with a man who was a living lie? I had to admit, he was really an excellent spy. I angrily retorted and said to him that I didn't want to live with him anymore. But he didn't seem to understand the concept. Why did I resent him for betraying my family? But my response stunned him. I didn't resent him. I told him I just couldn't resent anyone, even if the whole world was against me. Because I didn't deserve to. I told Heiner about the newspapers and how every column seemed to be clamoring for my death sentence. I shocked him more by saying that I had no problem getting killed if it was the people's desire. I hadn't changed one bit when it came to politics. I was still so naive, but one thing I'd come to learn was the truth behind rights and democracy. I now understood why the people wanted nothing to do with the monarchy. I still didn't understand it fully, but I'd come to accept it. Because everyone still blamed me? I asked Heiner if he was okay with my terms, dying if it pleased the people. He quickly lashed out and asked if I knew the implications of my words. I told him I didn't care, as long as I got my divorce. Even if it meant dying, I didn't want to meet my end as his wife. I didn't want to show this side of me to the man I once loved. I wanted to keep what was left of my pride. Heiner clenched his fist in rage. He said the word divorce thrice, spitting it with disgust as he reached for and grabbed me by my shoulders. He looked at me in the eyes and said, "The reason I could demand a divorce was because I had an easy life." Then he declared it like a death sentence. I'd always be his wife. He didn't stop there. He declared that all he wanted was for me to be unable to dream of freedom or happiness. He wished for me to endure the burden of unhappiness and pay for my mistakes right before him. Heiner let me go and rose to leave. He spoke to me over his shoulders without sparing me another glance. There was going to be a hotel opening banquet in a couple of days, and he wanted me to attend with him. I knew I didn't have a choice, but I dared to ask anyway. I asked if he'd take me by force if I refused to go with him. Heiner delivered the next round of words like a blow to my guts. If I continued defying him, he'd lock me up forever in a psychiatric ward. I looked at him in stunned silence. Heiner wasn't done speaking. He carried on, saying that there was no point in running away since he was always going to find me, because he had the power to do so. If I didn't want that to happen, I'd be better off following his instructions. I realized at that moment, Heiner had always been like this. I knew he'd approached me with an agenda, but I'd fooled myself into a delusional fantasy. I'd denied the truth and deceived myself. Even when his attitude towards me first changed, I'd concluded that he'd fallen out of love with me because I'd temporarily lost everything I had. I kept on telling myself he'd come back soon and we'd go back to our fairy tale love. Heiner hissed my name, cutting through my thoughts as he demanded an answer. I flinched in fright. But why didn't I realize the truth sooner? Love derived from benefits was nowhere near genuine. I finally conceded to Heiner's demands. I'd go to his hotel's opening banquet. I'd been foolish. He banged the door noisily on his way out of the room. I was left to battle the demons that had come to plague my life in recent times. Thanks to Heiner, I suffered from insomnia. I let out a sigh and began searching my drawers for the pills that could save me from my dilemma. I found them and popped them down my throat in a heartbeat. But they didn't feel enough. I picked up a small container holding more pills and toyed with the idea of popping them all down my throat at once. But I couldn't bring myself to do that. I let out a sigh of defeat. I went to my doctor, Dr. Burkle, by morning of the following day to tell him that the pills weren't working. I asked him for a new prescription, preferably something stronger, and told him how I'd woken up with a headache. Dr. Burkle shook his head and said I was searching for a drug capable of the impossible. Headaches were nothing to be alarmed about. But I didn't agree with him and asked if he really thought the headaches were normal. He gave me a hard glance before maintaining his position. They were. I nodded in defeat. But I had other symptoms as well. A constant feeling of nauseousness and fevers. I told the doctor this and complained that I just didn't feel well. But Dr. Burke wasn't convinced. He dismissed it as stress from a lack of exercise and advised me to walk around the palace a bit to stay fit. As far as he was concerned, I had a habit of exaggerating minor inconveniences. He was the royal physician and not my personal doctor after all. He flopped down 2 more packs of the sleeping pills on the desk. I could hear a maid giggle in the corner. I swallowed the embarrassment and thanked the doctor for his time. The days rolled by quickly, and the day for the hotel opening banquet came. Heiner held me perched on his arm, his lips curled up in a wicked smirk while my face was the total opposite. Mr. Schmidt, the owner of the hotel, quickly came around to welcome Heiner. Not sure he meant to welcome me as well. Mr. Schmidt thanked Heiner for his investment and asked about Franz, reasoning that whatever was happening there would affect the new branch he'd just established. Heiner confidently assured him that they'd keep Franz in check with help from Vitarus. I remained silent, mentally absent from the banquet even though I was physically present. Then came more people, with more greetings. And then we were ushered away to a huge reception area. But why had I ever assumed Heiner was a difficult man to read? Even though I was unwanted by virtually everyone at the banquet, Heiner still roped me in, to fulfill the bare minimum as his wife. It was all clear to me now. He probably wanted to punish me for rarely leaving the residence. After all, the banquet was filled with people with different vendetta against me. I drank a glass of wine and pretended not to listen, but I couldn't help eavesdropping on Heiner's conversation with the hotel owner. Schmidt asked about his marriage proposal to Lady Annalie, and Heiner told him that he'd declined it. Mr. Schmidt quickly expressed his surprise and added that everyone thought Heiner and Annalie would make a good couple. Heiner glanced in my direction as he answered and told them that he'd been right to decline a proposal he'd had no need for in the first place, because he was already married. His eyes were squinted in a frown as he spoke. I set down the glass in my hand and wondered how callous people could be to gossip about me like I wasn't just a few steps away from them. Did they think that less of me? How cruel! I'd picked up another glass of wine and lifted it to my lips when I felt a strong squeeze on my shoulder. I let out his name in a gasp of shock. Heiner? What did he want from me this time? The lights came on and the MC's voice came alive through the speakers. He asked if everyone was enjoying the evening, and in appreciation for our attendance, we'd be having a very special guest. The pride of Pedania. The guest was none other than the great maestro himself, pianist Felix Kafka. My eyes widened in awe and admiration as a small gasp escaped from my lips. Felix was popular for winning nearly all competitions all over the world. The other guests were electric with excitement, clapping and cheering as Felix stepped up to the piano. He was indeed the pride of Pedania. I watched on in disbelief. I couldn't believe I was listening to the legendary pianist again in my lifetime. Felix began playing, the notes sailing smoothly through the air. He was playing a familiar Piece Nocturne No. 2. It might have been 3 years since the last time I played the keyboard, but I could never forget that sweet melody. I held my hands against my chest as the waves of nostalgia hit. Felix gave life to the piece as he played. Felix Kafka had always been my role model. From the very first day I touched a piano, Felix's performances always inspired me to pursue my dream. At the end of his performance, the guests went wild with applause and cheers. Oh, Felix. I'd always wanted to be like him. I'd met Felix a couple of times in the past, courtesy of my father's connections. I'd even gotten his autograph, received his encouragement, and even spoken to him. I had a conversation with the legendary Felix Kafka himself. But everything has changed now. Felix had come from nothing, defied the odds, and made a name for himself. I felt a strange question tug at the back of my mind. Had Felix secretly despised me right from the beginning? Perhaps because of my privileged background? I settled into a sad silence until it finally struck me. Heiner's voice cut through my thoughts as he whispered my name gently. I opened my eyes and realized nearly everyone in the room was looking in my direction. Someone asked if I played the piano. I flinched in shock, completely unprepared. Another asked if I was going to play a song on the piano. I answered with a panicked stutter, hardly making any coherent statements. The murmurs kept flying about. One reminded me that I'd come in third in an international competition. Another asked if I didn't hold a recital. A strange lady approached me and began prodding me in the direction of the piano. I protested and said I hadn't played in a long time. I didn't trust my abilities on the piano anymore. But the lady was having none of it. She just assumed I was being humble and added that she'd heard I'd learned from a very long age. I maintained my protests, stealing a glance behind me to see Heiner's reaction, making a silent plea for him to at least intervene. But his eyes were expressionless and he did nothing to help me. The lady continued prodding me forward until she'd sat me down on the piano stool. I'd been foolish to assume Heiner would come to my rescue. I saw Felix watching from the crowd, his eyes full of sadness for me. Then I wondered to myself, will this monumental embarrassment satisfy everyone? Would it please them to see someone from a powerful family made into a laughingstock? I feared I wouldn't meet the expectations of the people who wanted to hear me play. My hands trembled as I held them over the keys of the piano. My mind kept rolling back in time, to the night that changed everything, the last time I'd ever played. My father had come into my room that night and asked me to run. There was no time to explain, but the urgency was evident in his voice. He asked me to turn around and use the back door. How would I have ever guessed that'd be the last thing I'd hear my father say to me? He was shot, murdered in cold blood right before my eyes. In my shock, I could hear my father's murderers argue back and forth among themselves. They'd been instructed not to kill anyone in the house, but the deed had been done already. While I was still rooted to the spot in shock, the door swung open with a loud thud, and in came one of them, pointing a long rifle at me. He had a hint of mischief in his voice as he confirmed my identity, and he laughed mockingly at me when he realized I'd been playing the piano only moments ago. His cohorts joined him, their voices dragging along like a nightmare. Meanwhile, much later, Heiner sat in his study, mulling over the events of the banquet pensively. He peered through documents until he just couldn't hold back the rage anymore. What in the world had possessed Annette at the banquet? He let out a curse, crumpled the paper in his hands, and tossed it away. I had suddenly begun to act possessed, attacking the piano with a violence that seemed so violent and primal in every sense. Everyone was shocked, including Heiner. No one could understand what was happening or what was wrong with me. Gasps of shock rang through the air as I dealt blow after blow to the piano. Heiner closed the gap between us, startling me in the process. I sobbed and told him I wanted to go home. As Heiner sat in his study, thinking back on the incident, he couldn't help but draw one conclusion. It had all the signs of trauma. But he wasn't okay with making excuses for me just like that. He clenched his fist, scrunching up a document in the process. How could it have been trauma? He knew I hadn't cried in 3 whole years. He'd assumed that all my life, I'd lived in a safe mansion, throwing parties for fun. Heiner didn't buy the trauma story. Not at all. He angrily flung more papers off his desk, but he'd seen on the night of the banquet. I'd been so genuinely rattled by an ordinary piano. That couldn't have been fake, right? But I'd also been the one who'd come to ask for a divorce days before, and with such a straight face. Heiner vowed not to let me go in peace, not after everything he'd been through just to have me. He didn't care how silly his choice might have seemed to other people. Heiner let out a loud sigh, grabbing his head in exasperation. I was a part of his past, one he was ashamed of, one he wished to erase. I walked into the room and hit the light switch. I pulled off the covers to reveal my first real love, my piano from the Rozenberg mansion. I stood before it. A wave of nostalgia hit me. I'd had it for as long as I could remember. I lifted up the lid and admired the familiar white and black keys my fingers had caressed for years. I knew what notes to play, but what was the point anyway? I couldn't bring myself to touch the keys, let alone play anything meaningful. It brought back the memory of my father's death. The day he died, my whole life was destroyed. Everyone was always quick to say I owed my success to my father's money, power, and connections. I'd thought that things would get better with time after he died, but now it was clear to me that I had nothing left. Meanwhile, Heiner learned from the house staff and Dr. Burkle that I wasn't eating, and I wouldn't leave the house too. He was livid. I was getting on his nerves. He marched straight off to my room and knocked hard on my door. When he let himself into the room, I wouldn't even look at him. He asked if I'd rather waste my day embroidering than eat my meals like everyone else. I didn't lift my eyes up from the piece I was working on as I asked if he was making a protest. I went on to apologize casually. Heiner's eyes trailed to the desk where he found packets of pills scattered on it. He marched over to the desk and peeked into the half-open drawer. I tried to stop him, but it was too late. He found a pill dish, different from the rest. He lifted it up and asked me to explain. I looked away as I said it was only medication, a half-lie. Heiner asked if the pills weren't prescribed by Dr. Burkle, but I simply told him they were the ones I didn't take. Heiner wasn't buying my lie, but he simply let out an exasperated sigh. He told me that he'd instructed the staff to bring my food and he was taking the pills away. I didn't hear him clearly, so I opened my mouth in protest, but swallowed my words back when I realized what he was doing. I maintained that I wasn't hungry, and Heiner asked if I wished to starve myself to death. I wasn't ready to change my mind. Then Heiner asked if I couldn't think of a better way to die. I was a Rozenberg princess after all. I felt a throb in my heart at his words. I bit down hard on my lips as we both fell into an awkward silence. There was a knock on the door, and in came a servant with the meal. Heiner asked them to leave the meal on the table and then turned to ask me to eat. I politely asked him to leave so I could eat when I wanted to. But Heiner was wise. He quickly argued that I'd send it back once he left, and he wasn't entirely wrong. I turned to him, my patience running thin as I demanded to know why it mattered to him whether I ate or not. Heiner was confused even though he didn't show it. He wondered why I was so sensitive. Perhaps the pills were making me act up. He finally spoke out and remarked that I was acting unlike myself. I tossed the embroidery to the side and let out a sigh before saying, with every bit of sarcasm in my voice, that he must have known a lot about me. How else would he have won me over in the first place? When I spoke again, my voice was more resolved. Things were more different now. I was no longer his lover, neither was I the Rozenberg princess. I was... nothing. Nothing. The word made my heart ache. Even though he didn't speak aloud, I could hear Heiner agree with me. After all, my status had been dragged down to the trash, and everyone I loved was gone. Was that what he really thought of me? Heiner wondered to himself. Just how I managed to stay beautiful and noble. How was I able to take him back to those old, miserable times? I couldn't have known what he thought about me, so I was stuck in the present. He threatened to use force if I refused to eat my food willingly. I was too tired to carry on fighting anyway. I picked up the spoon and began stirring the soup idly. Heiner's eyes scanned the space until they found the embroidery in the corner. It was nothing like the ones I'd made him in the past. I used to gift him handmade embroidery when we were still in love, pouring my heart into every detail. But now, my work looked like a child's plaything at best. While he was still lost in thought, I called out to him and informed him that I'd like to go away for a while to be by myself. Heiner didn't buy my idea. How could he tell that I wouldn't run off? I kept calm and admitted that I didn't think he'd accept my request anyway, but I just realized how I was always asking his permission for everything. I dropped my spoon down with a loud clatter. I'd barely put the food in my mouth the whole time. Heiner asked if he had to leave before I at least pretended to eat. He finally asked me to do as I pleased, but promised to ship me off to a psychiatric ward if I ever attempted to starve myself again. Afterwards, he left my room, banging the door behind him. I sunk back into my pool of despair and self-pity once he left. Heiner went into his study and picked up his telephone to call the resident doctor. Dr. Burkle was very eager to speak with him. He asked him about the pills he'd seen in my room earlier and described it to the doctor. Dr. Burkle explained that it was medication for my insomnia and asked if there was a problem. Heiner answered in the negative and placed the receiver down. He found everything ridiculous as he examined the pill dish for one last time. He flung the pill dish into the waste bin, wondering if I'd planned to kill myself with the pills. But he dismissed the thought of concluding that I didn't have the courage for the act. As far as he knew, I was only looking for a lifeline to fall back on if he insisted on refusing the divorce. Heiner was certain I had no idea what true misery was. It was deeper than trivial business such as gossip and the piano. I knew nothing about the tortures, the beatings, or hunger he'd had to suffer. sometime in the past. I'd once complimented Heiner's eyes. They were pretty. He said he'd never been told that in the past. I told him they were the prettiest, and he quickly asked if I thought the rest of him was ugly. I told him I had high standards and I'd never be with a partner who wasn't handsome. But Heiner, my sweet Heiner, told me that he would never have minded what I looked like. But he still thought I was the most beautiful person in the world. In Heiner's study, he frowned as he recalled the memory. He wished for me to know despair, for me to be unhappy. He wanted my life to be just as miserable as his had become. But even then, he vowed to be by my side when I crumbled. I sat by the water fountain, lost in my thoughts. I finally admitted to myself I was tired. I'd wondered what I could have done to fix my marriage. I'd considered giving Heiner children, and even though I didn't get a compassionate night like any wife would dream of, he didn't reject me. He never let me see his bare body, and we never held each other until the morning. He always left me in his cold and lifeless room. But I'd hoped Heiner would return to his former self. Why didn't he reject me? The sun felt warm against my skin. Was Heiner merely leading me on? I shut my eyes and suddenly didn't mind dying by the water fountain at that moment. My thoughts were interrupted as someone said hello in greeting. I looked up and my eyes lit up in recognition. Lady Annalie, who'd sent the marriage proposal to Heiner. She asked if I had a minute to talk, and I obliged. Major Markov stood in the distance, letting out a displeased sigh when our eyes met. She knew him too. Did they fight side by side in the coup? Markov eventually walked away, leaving me with Lady Annalie. She said she'd been looking forward to meeting me for a while. Of course, I didn't believe her. Annalie asked how life was at the residence. She'd heard I wasn't leaving the premises often enough. I simply told her I was trying to live a simple life. She smiled in agreement and added that she'd only seen me in the papers, so she was genuinely curious about me. Such hypocrisy. I cut her short at that point and told her I knew she'd not left her business to come and chat with me. I needed her to get down to the point already. A moment of tense silence passed between us before we spoke again. She'd heard what many others had heard. Heiner wasn't granting a divorce. Annalie finally took off the mask of pretense she'd been wearing and admitted she didn't really like me. Hating me would be more accurate. She despised me for my heritage as Marquis. She respected Heiner enough to know he deserved someone better than me by his side. Her marriage to him had to happen to keep the opposition in check. I calmly pointed out that she had to speak with Heiner rather than me. But Annalie quickly cut in with a stern warning. I turned to look at her, surprised by her bold affront. She quickly rephrased and said she wanted us to use both the media and government to make Heiner abandon our marriage. I let out a tired sigh. How petty could a person get for their selfish means? I told Annalie that I knew I'd become the subject of her publicity campaign and admitted that it had offended me at first. She'd been accusing me of things I'd barely had a hand in. Even while I was speaking, she quickly cut in and said that I wasn't exactly innocent. I agreed with her, not because she was right, but because I'd grown tired of everything. Even though the stories had been exaggerated, it was all still my fault. I was the villain. 3 years had gone by anyway, and I didn't hate her anymore. I respected the cause, and I truly did. With that, I rose to my feet and took a few steps away from the bench we'd been sitting on. I maintained that the divorce was no longer my decision, but urged her not to worry too much. My marriage to Heiner was on its way to the end. Sometime later, in the residence, I looked through the old financial records. There'd been some generous donations to the Citizens Association. I was interrupted by a knock on the door. A maid stepped inside and said I had a guest, a gentleman who claimed to be an old acquaintance. I was confused. An acquaintance? The maid added that he said I'd know his name. Ansgar. My eyes lit up in recognition and disbelief as I echoed the name. He stepped in and called out to me. Ansgar Stetter was the second son of Count Stetter, a friend of the Rosenbergs. It's been a long time since we last met. We'd grown up together, and he'd even proposed to me. When I'd refused his proposal, he'd gone off to Viderus to study, and we'd lost contact ever since. Ansgar enveloped me in a warm embrace once he came up close, leaving me with no time to react. He took one look at me and said I'd grown thinner than he remembered. Ansgar's family had fallen during the rebellion, but he'd been lucky to avoid danger since he was abroad. I pretended to be surprised that he found me thin, but he quickly intervened by saying I still looked beautiful. But the Pedanian citizens didn't hide their hatred for the aristocracy, and the people had branded me the villain already. As I led him to a lounging area, Ansgar said he'd sent me a letter, but I didn't respond, and that was why he'd come all the way to see me. I asked him if he'd sent the letter to my old address. I wondered what he'd need from me because I couldn't help him. Ansgar said he didn't. He sent it to me, as the wife of the commander-in-chief. He knew I'd never received any letters. I promised him I'd ask about it. I quickly switched the subject and asked after his well-being while we settled down for some tea. Was he back in Padania for good? Ansgar said he was only in the city to tie up some loose ends and pay me a visit. He was now the ambassador in France, the enemy territory in Heiner's and his subjects' books, that is. Ansgar said he'd fled to France after his graduation, like most other people did after the rebellion. I congratulated him on his appointment as an ambassador. But he waved it off modestly and said things might have been better if he'd never left. I wondered what he'd meant to imply by that statement. Ansgar said he was married and got divorced only the previous year. I gasped in surprise. He admitted he'd only married the lady for citizenship. He set down his teacup and said he had something to ask me. He'd heard about how the people had turned me into an object of hate for their publicity, and my husband had done nothing to help the situation. He finally asked the question of the century. Was I going to stay in my marriage? I was caught off guard by the directness of his question and glanced in the direction of the maid before answering. I told Ansgar I wanted to stay in the marriage only temporarily. I wanted a divorce too, but I had to wait until the time was right. Ansgar quickly asked if it was because I had nowhere to go if I got divorced. I sighed in frustration and told him not to remind me of my situation, but Ansgar stated that he had different intentions. He made me an offer to join him in France. I was stunned by his offer. Ansgar didn't stop there. He said he still had feelings for me, and if I married him, I could get citizenship. He offered me his hand and asked me to take his offer, because I'd be happier. My mind strolled back down memory lane. Heiner's promise to love me forever. Why did I remember that moment? I stuttered my next response. My husband wouldn't approve. Ansgar didn't back down. He said it'd be easier to move away once I got the divorce. Things weren't looking good for me, and he was my only option. I finally asked him to give me some time to think about his offer. It had come a little unexpected. Ansgar apologized for being too forward with his offer. He'd been looking forward to seeing me again, making his offer to me. He offered to give me his contact instead, and while he searched his pockets for his card, he recalled he was staying in a hotel. He took out a pen and a little note card and scribbled down his room number, saying I could come straight to him whenever I was ready. I couldn't help but notice that Ansgar had felt a bit unfamiliar a moment ago. But now, he's reverted to his old self, like when we were kids. I smiled as I received the note card from him, my mind traveling back to the past for a moment. Back to when I was ignorant. Ansgar made me promise to get back to him if I ever needed help. Once he was gone and the door was shut behind him, I couldn't help but wonder why Ansgar had come to me. I read the fine calligraphy of his name on one side of the card and turned to the other. Everything ran through my mind. Ansgar's family, his appointment as ambassador in France, his marriage, everything. I thought about my father, the king's nephew, and my royal lineage. And then I flinched instantly as a realization hit me. Was Ansgar reaching out to me for a restoration of the monarchy? Everyone who supported the monarchy in Padania had all been crushed by Heiner Waldemar. He'd won the heart of all Padania with the way he handled things after all the chaos that followed the revolution. Likewise, the nobles who'd fled to France needed help from outside forces. Ansgar's offering of his hand took on a new meaning to me. If it took his hand, I'd be able to help him and the other nobles. And it was also the right thing to do. My last chance to escape from Heiner. I sat down to a silent dinner with Heiner much later in the day. The air was pierced by nothing but the clatter of cutlery against china. I could feel the heat of Heiner's gaze on my skin while I toyed idly with my food. He finally broke the silence. He'd heard about Ansgar's visit to the residence. I paused, my hand hanging before my mouth. He asked what we talked about. I shifted my gaze to the floor and asked if he hadn't already heard everything from the staff anyway. They'd told him about Ansgar's visit, right? Heiner calmly stated that he wanted to hear it from me. I sighed and told him that Ansgar wanted me to move to France after finalizing the divorce. But Heiner jumped to his own conclusions instantly. He asked if I'd asked for the divorce because I wanted to be with Ansgar. I had to point out that I'd not seen Ansgar for years, more time than I'd known him for. But Heiner wasn't ready to let the matter rest. He said I could have been in touch with Ansgar behind his back. He'd not thought much of it in the past, but with Ansgar's visit, then it struck me, the letters. I confronted him about the letters, and Heiner instantly told me he had no business explaining himself to me. He added that I could never take Ansgar's hand, and I was never leaving the residence. The room fell back into silence. What had I expected? If Ansgar really was a part of the restoration forces, then Heiner would never hand me over. That was a fact. Maybe his reason for denying me the divorce was purely political, to have the legal advantage over his enemies. And I felt the same sense of duty myself. Ansgar wasn't any different from my husband. I was glad he'd visited, and I might have considered his offer in the past, but he also wanted to use me as a tool to win the battle because of my royal blood. I was only a tool to all these people. But I was done being used. I only wondered why Heiner's people disagreed with him. They wanted me and Heiner to get separated, even though I wanted that more than most people. So why didn't he want the same thing? I dressed up in preparation for church, putting on a veiled hat to hide my face from the public. I told the guard I met at the giant entrance doors that I didn't need an attendant, but he insisted that I needed Heiner's permission if I wanted to leave by myself. I told him I didn't want the stress, and just when he was about to carry on with his stubbornness, I lost it. I yelled and asked him if I needed permission to pray, and that finally seemed to drive the message home for him. He let me through, and I walked undisturbed out of the residence. I flagged down the first horse carriage rider I saw and asked to be taken to the Rochester station. I held my breath anxiously until I was safely seated in a carriage on the train. I didn't think I'd ever come close to other human beings in my life again. I prayed with all I had that the newspapers wouldn't carry my face by the next morning. I fell into silence, and from the corner of my eyes, I spotted an old lady making prayers through a sacred worship relic. I wondered what she could be praying so desperately for. I'd stayed away from church for far too long. Everyone had testimonies to share about how the gods answered their prayers. But my story was different. Nothing changed for me no matter how hard I prayed. I'd gotten tired of making the same prayers for salvation and forgiveness. There was no hope in that life for me. All I wanted now was to see the ocean like I did in my dreams. I let out a sigh and looked away from the old lady. I was startled by the sound of her voice moments later as she called out to me to ask what the matter was. I apologized and waved off her concerns, but the lady was persistent in a kind way, of course. She'd only asked because she'd heard me sigh heavily. She asked if I was going somewhere, and I told her I was going to see the ocean for a change of scenery. She seemed to find it mildly strange that I was going alone and not with a lover. I admitted to her that I was married, but I didn't get along so well with my husband, and we were talking about getting a divorce. She asked if we had any children, and I answered in the negative. The old lady tried to cheer me up and said it was almost very normal for young people to get a divorce, unlike in the past when people considered it a flaw. Then she jokingly added that the times had changed and even the aristocrats were all gone. I pursed my lips in tense silence. What would she do if she learned about my past, about my family? She broke through my thoughts by asking why I didn't get along with my husband. I was hesitant to share the details of my life with a total stranger, but eventually just let it all out. I told her that my husband and the people around him hated me so much that they wanted me dead, and I didn't want to live with him anymore either. She agreed in understanding. She knew what it felt like to be in my position. No one took being hated on lightly, but no one had any control over things like that. She added that life was better off lived for those who cared about us. I had my thoughts about her opinion. But even if I couldn't expect everyone to love me, I just didn't want them to despise me so much. And worse still, everyone who genuinely loved me was dead. What was left for me to do now? I finally got to the ocean side. The sun was setting, its fading light staining the skies a fiery orange that painted everything under it. The air was filled with the sound of seagulls calling, ocean water overlapping at the banks and the wind traveling through clothes and hair. It felt like stepping into a dream. An old one. How long had I been away from the ocean for? I hadn't been to the ocean since I got married to Heiner. Everything was so beautiful. I spotted a painter in the distance and contemplated asking if his work was for sale. As if he'd read my mind, he said he was selling the paintings and asked me to make my pick. While I was still contemplating whether or not to browse through the paintings, he offered to paint me for free. I was overwhelmed by surprise. Was it okay? I'd need to take my hat off if I accepted. That'd give my cover away. What if the painter recognized me right away? He seemed to notice the internal battle I was fighting, and then he offered to paint me with my hat on. That gave me the confidence to take the hat off. I wondered if he didn't know me or pretended not to. Whichever way, it was all good for me. I asked him how long it'd take for him to complete the painting. He jokingly said it wouldn't take too long and that I was asking too many questions for a freebie. Then he asked me for a smile. I was caught off guard by the suddenness of his request. It'd been a while since someone asked me to just smile. I tried a little twitch of my lips and asked if that was fine. But the painter teased me and made a funny face to mimic the way I'd been smiling. My face flushed with embarrassment when I saw it, and I tried a different expression. The painter instantly liked it and screamed enthusiastically. He painted and painted, while I sat silently, until he was done. When he handed the painting over to me, I was dumbstruck by its beauty. It looked too beautiful. Even more beautiful than I believed I looked. The painter laughed and jokingly said it had a mix of his skills and my already beautiful face. I told him I really loved it, but was too embarrassed to hang my own face up on the wall. I offered to buy a different painting instead, and the painter let me go ahead to make my pick. I'd been admiring a painting of the seaside since I bumped into the painter. He said it was the local sea in Glenford and praised my taste in art. I asked for the price, and he gave me a discount since I'd modeled for him. I thanked him as I paid for the painting. But I couldn't have known that what had been a fine evening was heading off to a sour turn. I walked along the shore, picking up seashells and storing them in the pocket of my blouse. Then for a moment, I felt the water pull me ever so gently, coaxing me to come in deeper. I held up my dress and kept moving forward, burying my body in the water 1 inch deeper with every step. And then suddenly, I lost my footing and was sure to fall into the ocean when a strong pair of arms caught me. I looked up into very stern yet familiar eyes Heiner's. He squeezed my shoulders hard and asked where I thought I was going. Only hours ago. Heiner had gotten wind of my little escape, every step I'd taken, from the carriage to the train to the oceanside. I hadn't known at the time, but a memo was passed out to every checkpoint and train station to be on the lookout for me whenever I went out by myself. They all reported directly to Heiner, so he could catch me at any time. He'd been with me every step of the way, even at the train station, but my attire couldn't have given off the impression that I was running away. He must have been confused as to what I hoped to achieve with my strange behavior. He must have suspected I'd gone to meet with Ansgar secretly, while I was headed to Glenford by myself. Heiner fought hard to keep from dragging me back to the residence, if only to know where I was headed. It wasn't difficult tailing me anyway. Heiner had most certainly listened in on my conversation with the old lady everything. And I bet the one thing he agreed the most with from our conversation was this: he couldn't care less what happened to me. Even if I died, he wouldn't care. He knew I had no one left who loved me or cared about me, at least. Well, except him. But I wouldn't have known this. I wouldn't have known he wished for us to be together till the very end. Even if what we shared wasn't love. Heiner kept an eye on me the whole time. My whole interaction with the painter. Everything. Even down to the time I'd laughed at the painter's mimicry of my face. Heiner hadn't seen me smile so hard in a long time. In fact, he hadn't seen me smile since after the days of our courtship. Heiner clenched his fist by his side. He was wasting too much time sitting by the sidelines and watching me. He wanted to grab me and haul me off to the residence. He couldn't stand seeing me happy or enjoying my freedom, however temporarily. He felt the urge to warn me that running off again would get me locked up as punishment. But something about my smile made his legs stop working momentarily. He pulled me out of the ocean and onto the shore. I kept my eyes to the ground and told him that I'd expected him to catch me earlier. Heiner brushed off my sarcastic comment and commanded me to put myself together immediately. I took a step in the direction of my things and stepped on a broken seashell buried in the sand. I let out a yelp of pain, and Heiner instantly materialized by my side. He shoved my things in my chest and hoisted me onto his shoulders before I could protest. I struggled to get down, stating that I could walk and that the injury was not as serious as it seemed, but Heiner calmly asked me to stay still. I flinched and finally settled into feet. Why was he so angry that I'd run away? I'd assumed he'd send one of his men after me and not come all the way. By himself. Heiner marched all the way to the hotel in the Glenford countryside and walked up to the front desk. He didn't mind that we were in a crowded place. I clung to him tightly, burying my face in his shoulder in embarrassment. Heiner grabbed me tighter against himself and booked us a room. Inside the room, he let my things drop to the floor in a loud clutter and carried me off to the bathroom, dropping me delicately into the bathtub. I quickly announced that I could wash myself before he had any ideas. It wouldn't have been unusual for him to. Heiner gently walked away, leaving me to clean myself up. I flinched in pain as the water stung my injury. The cut was deeper than I'd thought. Once I was done, I went out to find Heiner hunched by the bedside, a first aid kit by his feet. He nodded for me to come sit before him, and I obliged. He took my foot gently and bandaged the cut. In Pedania, nobles weren't supposed to show off their feet to anyone else. Even though I'd been married to Heiner for 3 years, we'd never really seen each other's bodies. I was red with embarrassment as he tugged on the bandage on my foot. He asked me what I'd been thinking. What had been so important to me that I'd had to lie to the attendant at the door? Just to come to a place like this? He looked up at me, accusation in his eyes as he hopped on another line of suspicion. I looked down at him innocently and explained that I'd only wanted to see the ocean. Heiner kept silent. Whether or not he'd believed me, he didn't say. Then he spoke. He'd thought I was going to meet Ansgar Stetter, but with the way I jumped into the ocean, there had to be more. I looked away in guilt and said I was only trying to soak my feet. He flashed me a smirk and said with every hint of sarcasm that he believed me, since I was scared of a lot of things. He listed them one by one like he'd memorized them and dismissed them off as trivial. He was angry that I couldn't bother to worry about what could happen to me while moving about without protection, leaving my property in the sand carelessly without fear that they could be stolen. Heiner added that he was sure I'd never had to watch my own things. He always had some bit of loathing to pour into the smallest reprimands. It was clear he despised me for the fortune my family had once enjoyed. I looked away from him in embarrassment and conceded in defeat. He was right after all. Heiner launched into a fit of rage, and in his frustration, he voiced the truth to my hearing. He'd always hated me for it. The world had changed, but I'd stubbornly refused to follow suit, so much that it drove him insane. He spat the next round of words like a snake's venom. I was the same disgusting aristocratic woman I'd always been. His words hurt me. How long had he hated me for? Had he always hated me? Even from the moment we first met? But beyond that, what did he think of my love for him? The answer left my lips accompanied by a bitter smile. He must have thought I was foolish. It was Heiner's turn to be stunned. I told him to think about everything. He'd played a man in love with a woman he despised, and that woman fell for it hook, line, and sinker. She'd even admitted she loved you too. It must have been a joke to him. I clenched my fists on my lap and continued. I asked Heiner the real question. If he'd truly despised me, why didn't he tell me 3 years ago, after the kingdom fell, and my parents died and he got everything he'd wanted? He could have told me. And even though he didn't tell me, I'd still loved him the same way for 3 years. Heiner's eyes were wide in shock as I dropped my own truth. The truth is, I'd always believed he'd come back. I believed he'd smile for me again, that he'd change his mind and love me again. But just how many more times did I have to pick myself up from the ground? Heiner was stunned and stuttered as he asked me the next question. Did I still love him? I was silent. I answered and told him I wasn't so sure. What was the point in it? It wouldn't change anything. My feelings were useless. I vowed aloud never to let anyone use me the way Heiner Waldemar had used me. Ever. After his outburst in my confession, I settled for a bath. Heiner had instructed an attendant to bring my luggage to the hotel. Did he plan to stay the night here? I asked him the question before I could think otherwise. Did he want to stay in the room with me? Heiner gave me a little glance before rising to his feet as he asked if I'd run away if he went somewhere else. I told him that's not what I meant. He shot me a glare and warned me against leaving. He threatened to have the attendant drag me back if I did. And with that, he left the room, banging the door behind him. I stayed on the large bed by myself, lost in thought. If Heiner was so busy, because I'd seen him with paperwork even in the hotel, why did he come to get me in person? He had many attendants in his service and many more loyal followers who would jump to do his bidding if he gave the order. And why was he so angry? I was so confused. Did he not want to see me at all? Or did hate me so much to want me to live in despair before his very eyes? Forever? I gave up on a conclusive answer. Heiner came into the room moments later and was surprised to find me still awake. I told him I couldn't sleep. When I reached for my sleeping pills, he grabbed my arm. He asked me if I'd been taking the pills every time I couldn't sleep and reasoned that they couldn't be good for me. I sighed and told him I wouldn't take them if I could. Heiner angrily grabbed the envelope of pills and yelled for me to stop taking them. He asked if I wanted to get addicted. Heiner made me stay still. All I could think of was the irritation in his voice. It was always the same whenever he got angry. The old Heiner was never like this. Sure, we'd had our differences as a couple, but they never lasted longer than a thought. And Heiner was always the one to apologize first. Then he'd hold me close and kiss me. Gosh, he was such a great actor, pretending just to get to my father. I know it was no good, but I couldn't stop thinking about the past. Heiner handed me a mug of something steaming hot and assured me that it'd help me sleep. I shyly asked him what it was, and he said it was chamomile tea. It was warm. While I silently sipped the tea, Heiner announced that he was going to look through my things. I looked at him in surprise, but he didn't stop. Heiner was looking through my things. This was new. He spotted the pills right away and asked why I had so many of them. They looked like sleeping pills. I told him some were painkillers and others were digestive medication. Heiner quickly cut in and asked what Dr. Burkle had to say. I told him exactly what the man had said. I was too sensitive. Heiner didn't seem surprised. He must have thought it was true, what the doctor had said. He searched through the luggage some more and found Ansgar's note card. He studied it closely without saying a word. I quickly jumped in to speak about Ansgar, before he made the usual conclusions. I asked Heiner if there really was a restoration force in Franz like Ansgar had said. Heiner was surprised. He asked if Ansgar had told me about this force and about joining him since they wanted to restore the monarchy. I told Heiner I'd only just thought about it myself. I wasn't hiding anything from him, and I had no plans to follow Ansgar. Heiner wasn't quite convinced. Ansgar still had feelings for me, and he was unmarried. Heiner said he wouldn't let me leave because I now had a place to go, and he was certain I'd gain nothing by telling him the truth. I mused over his words silently before asking him if he hadn't set out with the intention of making the world a better place. Because despite his cruelty to me, everyone thought Heiner had made the world a better place. And while I couldn't understand, everyone else said things were going to get even better. Heiner walked up close to me, planting his hands on the bed either side of me. He snapped and told me he didn't need my pity. He asked me not to think at all. He'd done just fine until now. I was too drained to deal with his sudden change of emotions. I calmly repeated that I wasn't going with Ansgar whether or not he believed me. I was tired and I had to sleep. And Heiner let me sleep, even though I could feel the heat of his eyes on me most of the night. While I slept, Heiner pulled the blanket over my body. He didn't find it comfortable staying with me in the same room. He regretted it, in fact. He battled the wave of thoughts that came flooding his mind before he couldn't help it any longer. He went snooping around my things again, searching for nothing in particular until he noticed a bulge in my clothes from the beach. He dipped his hand inside the pocket and pulled out the seashells I'd gathered at the beach. He didn't see the beauty I saw in them because they went straight into the trash basket. Heiner stepped out to the balcony and pulled a smoke piece up to his lips. He mimicked the huffing sound he'd make on a drag if it was lit and let out a long exhale. He felt a little better afterwards. Heiner had given up smoke pieces when he'd first met me, but he liked to hold them in his mouth in dark, confined spaces. Since we'd both been very honest to each other only moments ago, Heiner saw no need to impress anymore. He could just light the piece and enjoy it. But he couldn't. Even if he tried to deny it, I made him feel the most vulnerable and miserable with no end. He let the smoke piece drop to the floor and returned to the room. He peeked at the trash again, and the shells seemed to remind him of our exchange from earlier, how I'd said my feelings were useless. Heiner thought otherwise. Because he wished for me to feel despair and misery when they weren't reciprocated, just like he'd felt in the past. That was his sole mission for being with me. A few days later, I was going through the records and stumbled on the Citizens Association donation log. Right behind the document sat a jewelry box, the real reason I'd gone searching in the safe. I picked up its content and walked out to the car. I asked the driver if there were any jewelry stores around that weren't swamped up, and he recommended one, but quickly added that I'd have to walk a bit because the store was in a narrow alley. I didn't have a problem with walking. He drove off, and in less than no time, we arrived at the store. He waited for me outside while I went into the store alone. The storekeeper welcomed me and asked how he could help me. I searched my bag and told him I'd come to sell some jewelry. He asked me to place them on a tray, and I did as I was told. I waited while he slipped on his glasses to see them properly. He gasped at their beauty almost immediately. Heiner had always known how much I adored shiny things, so no matter how expensive, he always got me something whenever we went out on a date. I could still recall the story behind every single piece before me, the swan most especially. When Heiner had got it for me, I gushed over its beauty, and he told me he'd bought it because it reminded him of me. I told him my room was swelling with all his many gifts, and if I got any more, I'd most likely get buried under them. But Heiner, as sweet as ever, was quick to reassure me with that misleading softness in his voice. He only wanted for me to have all the shiny things my heart desired. Of course, I'd fallen for it and even asked him if he were proposing to me. Heiner promised to make the proposal even more impressive, and I, like a silly lovesick princess, soaked up all of it and asked if I could look forward to it. The world had seemed so beautiful at the time. As Heiner's wife, nearly all my belongings as a Rozenberg, and even those I'd gotten as Annette Waldemar, had either gotten seized or donated. But after everything, I believed it was only right to let them all go. I didn't want to be remembered by them after my death. The storekeeper's voice brought me out of my reverie. The quotes were ready. After weighing them, they all amounted to merely 2,300 pounds. The storekeeper asked if I had any questions, and I told him I didn't. But as I glanced at the diamond ring on my finger, I had a different idea. I considered selling the ring as well. The storekeeper examined it closely and said it had cost probably over 7,000 pounds. But he apologized and explained that the store couldn't afford to buy something so expensive. I'd have to try a bigger store. I took the ring back with a hint of disappointment in my voice. But 2,300 didn't sound like enough money. I'd never had to live by my means in my life, but I knew without being told that the money wouldn't last anyone a few years. I examined the ring again and figured it made sense that the jewelry I'd managed to sell fetched me 2,300 pounds despite their small size. But to think that the ring alone cost 7,000 was just too much to process. I couldn't recall ever owning an item so expensive, not even in my days as a Rozenberg. Did Heiner make the mistake of proposing with an expensive ring because he thought I'd be sad otherwise? After all, he'd called me an airheaded woman, born into a wealthy family with no clue what happened in the world, a vain woman who got everything she wanted. Maybe he was right. I picked the money realized from the sales and exited the store. I walked with my driver along the alley to the car. From the corner of my vision, I noticed a man standing underneath a lamppost. Was he looking at me? I wasn't comfortable with his gaze. Then suddenly, without warning, he pulled out a firearm and aimed at me. I was too stunned to react quickly or get out the plea forming at the back of my throat. He fired a couple of times more than I could remember as I dropped to the ground. My driver jumped into alert and pulled out his own weapon to return the assault. He scared the attacker away before turning back to me. In my state of pain, I could hear the driver ask if I was all right. I held my side in agony and looked in horror when I pulled my hand away to reveal blood. My blood! I groaned in discomfort, fighting to stay alive. Did getting shot hurt this bad, or was I imagining the pain? I'd heard Heiner got shot 3 times. Did he hurt just like I was hurting now? My stomach felt like it was burning. I recalled the look in my attacker's eyes full of hate. I wondered why he didn't aim for my head instead if he despised me so much. While I was knocked out cold and unconscious, the driver called Heiner right in the middle of a meeting and reported the situation to him. I was in a hospital, but the doctor said I was not in critical condition. Heiner wasted no time and asked for the address of the hospital. He instructed an attendant to prepare the car and dismissed his meeting prematurely. An attendant led him to the prepared car and he called out the address of the hospital where I was with urgency. The attendant wasted no time in zooming off. Heiner put a smoke piece between his lips to ease off the building tension while he mulled over the words that had disrupted his fine morning. I'd been shot, but not in critical condition. He tapped his foot restlessly on the floor of the car. Once he arrived at the hospital, Heiner marched straight up to the front desk and demanded to see me. The nurse quickly offered to lead him to me. They walked through the hospital corridors and came to a stop at the room where I was. Heiner looked at my unconscious form wordlessly. The attending physician introduced himself immediately, and Heiner asked how I was. The doctor responded saying that I'd been brought in just in time to take care of the situation, and the wound wasn't deep, so it was going to heal quickly. But he had some sad news. I'd been in my first trimester at 11 weeks, but miscarried. I'd been pregnant. It was the after effect of the surgical procedure to save my life. Heiner stared in shock and disbelief. Heiner asked the doctor to repeat himself, and he stuttered the same words. I'd miscarried. Heiner was livid. He asked to confirm I'd been pregnant. The doctor seized the moment to also break more bad news. I might never conceive again. I was very weak, and if they'd induced labor, I might never have lost the ability to have kids ever. Heiner's mind reeled endlessly with the words he'd just heard. Pregnant, miscarried, 11 weeks. I'd met Heiner many times in the past, just to ask him to make love to me. I'd made requests like that a little frequently, and Heiner figured I'd convince myself that a child could mend our broken marriage. But I'd never gotten pregnant in 4 years. Not even once. The doctors had branded me weak, so Heiner never really thought I could conceive at all. But to get pregnant? That was a whole different level. The doctor assured Heiner that I'd wake up soon and the pregnancy tissue would pass naturally. Our child was only a tissue. Heiner instructed him not to let anyone else know about the incident, and the doctor agreed before asking if he had any more questions. Heiner hesitated a bit before bringing up my insomnia and how it had become worse in recent times. He asked if the pregnancy had contributed to it, and the doctor answered speculatively by saying the first trimester came with many symptoms. Heiner wasn't satisfied with his vague answer. He explained in more detail that I may have had trouble sleeping, suffered from indigestion and headaches as well. He clenched his fists by his sides as he spoke. Heiner told the doctor about my pills and asked if he could replace them with better ones. The doctor was quick to oblige and offered to help if Heiner needed anything else. Heiner could tell from the quiver in the doctor's voice that he was somewhat afraid of him. He'd certainly heard the rumors about him about us. Heiner's rigidness and our failing marriage. Exactly 3 months ago. I'd gone to Heiner's room to ask if he was busy, and he knew what I really needed. It was always me seeking after him, and never the other way around. Why couldn't he just say if he didn't want me at all? I didn't mind him rejecting my touch, my kisses, or kicking me out instead of holding me close. I stepped out of my clothes, and even with all of my skepticism, I still hoped he didn't say no. I still hoped he didn't reject me. I hoped he didn't send me away. when our bodies met on the softness of his bed. I longed to reach him, the real him, because I knew he'd leave me behind like crumbs once we were done. My eyes finally flickered open, and I looked around, disoriented. My stomach still hurts like I'd only just been shot. Heiner was by my bedside. And he looked different. He looked unlike himself. Both him and the doctor stared at me with confused glances on their faces before the doctor revealed the truth all of it. My mind raced back to all the signs I'd missed. I'd been unwell lately, but I'd blame myself for being too sensitive like Dr. Burkle had said. I'd wanted to carry Heiner's child so badly. And just when I'd finally succeeded, Heiner reassured me that the public would never find out about the incident. He promised to take care of it, so I didn't need to worry. According to him, the culprit had been arrested on the scene and an investigation had been launched to find out his intentions and accomplices. Because of the incident, Heiner had temporarily restricted the use of firearms for civilians, and since I'd been pregnant, the culprit could be charged for taking a life. I cut him off with 2 words: the child. I wanted to know how many weeks along the child was before the incident. Heiner answered and said 11 weeks. I figured it had to have been on that night, 3 months ago. That was the night I'd finally conceived. Heiner was quick to make a pacifying offer. If I was open to it, we could always adopt children. His words finally struck me. Adopt? Why did we need to adopt children? What was he not telling me? You think that was painful? Wait for what happens next. Comment part 2, and I'll drop the continuation. Make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. For those asking, the title of the manhwa is My Beloved Oppressor, and today's recap covered the story up to chapter 10. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.